Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever in the world you are, whatever time zone you are in. Today, we are having the inaugural seminar for Rethinking Accounting. It's a very exciting event and an exciting time, and also exciting to work with this pioneering organization called Rethinking Economics, which has actually, over the last 15 years, created a huge move towards making economics responsible, accountable, and also sustainable. My name is Professor Atul Shah from the City University of London. I have written two books relevant to this topic, Reinventing Accounting and Finance Education for a Caring, Inclusive, and Sustainable Planet, and the latest one, Inclusive and Sustainable Finance, which is also very relevant to this discussion. We have a tremendous expert panel today, including a very brave student from Warwick University, Sneha, and some eminent professors with years of experience in the area. I will be introducing them shortly. First, to welcome us, we have the Director of Rethinking Economics International, Lawrence Jones-Williams, to say a few words. Then Mzwanele, who is the the manager of the campaign and the organizer of the network, and a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. And then followed by the panelists speaking 10 minutes each about their perspective on rethinking accountancy. And then finally, we'll have a discussion around this. And this is when also, given that you're coming from different parts of the world, we'd love to hear from you about what your perspective is about how accounting should change and what your experience is about accounting in your own country. So welcome, and let's get started. So Lawrence, please set us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Atul. It's a real pleasure, actually, to be talking about this. At Rethinking Economics International, we've been working for the last 5 years to change economics education around the world. We started as just a small group of students based in Manchester and then other universities, but really quite a sort of disparate group of people all calling for more critical, ethical, and sustainable education. And over the last, in fact, 10 years, we've grown to about 140, 160 groups. One of the real sort of reasons we've been able to grow as well has been our real focus on student power and student mobilizing. We've really tapped into the excitement and the energy of students that ultimately want to live and work in a world which they think is just and for what we call people and planet. And actually the work that students did for, to bring together groups, talk to their professors, negotiate with their professors as well. This is work that we've been doing for such a long time. Now, for me, when we started talking about accountancy, I mean, I was personally very excited because I've studied accountancy, and I always feel like I'm catching up with economics and the economists within our network. Whereas this is something that, for at one time I studied accountancy and, was thinking about becoming an accountant. And my brother actually, we studied together, and he actually continued. And it's been quite interesting for us to just explore this as an idea. And it's what's been quite stark is how much consistency there is among the feeling among the people that we've spoken to about this campaign. There is definitely a need to reform accountancy education for the future of the profession and the discipline more generally. But clearly, what we think we've identified in this discussion as well is that possibly, there's a real big question about the degree, its purpose, its role, and the limits that are put on it as an educational tool. So yeah, so we're really excited to be here and to be talking about this. And yeah, thank you for bringing together the panel and the committee. So yeah, I'll pass back to you, Atul.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Lawrence. I mean, we couldn't have a better platform than Rethinking Economics to start this conversation. Our next speaker is actually a lecturer at the University of Cape Town in South Africa and a PhD student at the University of Birmingham. Mzwanele, he has done a lot of fantastic work getting us to this stage and getting you enrolled on this webinar, and he's going to pioneer this whole campaign. So Mzwanele, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Atul, and good afternoon, colleagues from in the UK and everywhere else in the world. Mine is quite simple. I am the Rethinking Accountancy organizer, and I'm going to briefly introduce the Rethinking Accountancy campaign, which is basically a more exploratory work that has been undertaken by Rethink Economics International starting last year, September. The idea really came about as a result of many accounting scandals that we see, as well as how stringent the accounting curriculum at universities feels. And speaking of these accounting scandals, perhaps the Lehman Brothers in the US accounting scandal arguably remains the biggest and most notorious incident of the past 20 years, as many would know that in the early 2000s, the global conglomerate managed to disguise over $150 billion of loans as sales. And this act would significantly then contribute to what became known as the 2008 financial crisis. What they really did was exploiting the gaps in the accounting standards language regarding repurchase agreements and manipulated the balance sheets to reflect rising profitability. So in as much as there's been a lot of corrective measures that have been undertaken to correct what they had done, but we're witnessing every day that the scandals are becoming more frequent and lasting, and some are global while others are regional, and their impact affects most of us negatively. I think in the UK recently, the KPMG scandal, the Tesco scandal, where they were basically delaying payments so that they could bump up their profits. I think last year, we know in the US, in Canada, Australia, as well as here in the UK, that our students cheated in the ethics exam. So many accounting firms had to pay fines as a result of that. So colleagues, the scandals, as we know, are quite endless, and the connects and disconnects in the accountancy education as well as practice is quite apparent. And since we've started this campaign, we've engaged a lot of accountancy regulatory bodies such as ICAY, ACA, and others, as well as students, professionals, and academics. And what you do find in all of these engagements is everyone agreeing that there's something fundamentally wrong with the accountancy education curriculum as well as the profession. And ideas about critical accounting, as well as sustainable accounting, ethical accounting, and all of these ecological questions come into play. And part of the questions that we are seeking to answer in this campaign is, what role does the accountancy education play in the way in which professional accountants ultimately conduct themselves? We try to find out if in the way that accountants work speaks to their own ethics as well. On the other side, the Future of Jobs report that was published in 2020 by the World Economic Forum indicates that many accounting jobs will become obsolete as automation and integrated networks take over. So indeed, colleagues, as members of society, we can choose to focus on the narrow and sectional interests that often define our existential concerns and subsequently suffer the collective ruin. Or we can do look in the other side and participate in this Rethinking Accountancy campaign, which basically says that we shouldn't look at accountancy as merely about financial statements, reporting, and narrow advice that should continue to be used as an instrument in the modern economy for self-serving purposes and reaching a select few. So we are a group of students, academics, and community members that are calling for the Rethinking Accountancy Education and Profession, mainly because we believe that the current accountancy education is narrow, culturally uniform, and insufficiently responsive to the ethical challenges of the profession and those of modern society. And this lack of responsiveness in the profession as well as the curriculum perpetuates the socio-economic as well as environmental injustices. So there is a concerted effort to separate accountancy from social sciences by emphasizing complex numbers, models, standards, frameworks, and regulations. And this bereaves the profession of its obligation and responsibility to ensure justice and proper governance. So we are calling for a more socially, economically, and environmental responsive pedagogies and epistemologies in accountancy education that will give rise to critical professionals that will address the world's current and future challenges of socioeconomic inequality and climate injustice and foster sustainable futures. So currently the campaign is me as the organizer. We have a steering committee composed of Professor Susan Smith, who is here today from University College London, Prof. Atul K Shah, who is also our program director here from the City University London, Professor Adam Lever, who is not here today, but is from the University of Sheffield, Dr. Alice Dreyer, who is from the University of Bristol, as well as Kaya Sitole, who is the Chartered Accountant, South Africa, also a graduate of Queen's College, London. The elements of the campaign, we're going to have a range of things, such as student surveys that really try to undertake and see how students respond to their curriculum and whether they see whether the curriculum meets their aspirations, as well as what they may do at the end of their university degree, and the reasons that drive them to different business schools, as there is also a conversation around the role of business schools in accountancy as well as in the general professional world. We're also going to have local engagements and events to all sort of engage professionals on how we can change and make accounting, even in practice, more ethical, more critical, and more sustainable, and also embark on a lot of research projects that are going to, again, look at proposing new accounting education as well as professional frameworks. And all of this work requires a range of people and a range of stakeholders to make sure that our voices are one and our voices are being heard, and we call for a change in the accountancy education as well as in the profession. So I think we call for a lot of support from a whole lot of members that are present here today, but also those who are going to continue to engage as we're trying to call for rethinking accountancy. Thank you very much, Program Director.
Here, here. Thank you. That was very well said. And it's clear that we're going to be well led as a campaign. So congratulations for making such a bold and positive start. Listeners would have heard about decolonizing the curriculum. They would have heard about sustainability and climate change. And all these issues are extremely topical today. And the profession needs to change. Fortunately, many of you may not know this, but for the last 50 years, starting from the United Kingdom, there has been a huge growth in critical accounting and research in critical accounting all over the world. And some of those pioneers are here today in the panel, and they'll talk about it. So unlike the experience of rethinking economics, where the academics were the problem and were really not supportive of change, here you have actually a lot of academics who are and would be supportive of change. So our first speaker for this panel is Professor Joan Ballantine from the University of Ulster. She is a real expert in accounting education. Over to you, Joan.
Okay, thank you, Atul. Just at the outset, just to remind everyone, I've been asked to speak to certain questions, and really, unfortunately, 10 minutes doesn't absolutely do this justice at all. And before I start, I would like to say that the question about abolishing or reforming accountancy degrees is a very, very complex one that is shaped by history. And I think that we as accounting academics absolutely have the power to do it, but whether or not we feel we are capable and free to change, I'm in favour of reform rather than abolishing, because I think if we don't do it and we're well placed to do it, then somebody else, the private educators, will step into our shoes to do it, and they will make an even worse job of it. So the first question, I've been asked to briefly outline the historical foundations of accountancy education in the UK. And for those of you who maybe aren't very aware of what has been happening, accounting as an academic discipline really only is a relatively recent phenomenon, starting really since World War II. The 1960s in particular witnessed a period when the number of higher education institutions offering dedicated accounting degree programs in the UK increased, and the number of students increased also. And it was around this time that the accountancy profession also moved towards graduate entry. Degree programs, the growth in degree programs at that time was partly prompted by the UK government's expansionary plans for higher education under the Robbins Report, for those of you who want to read a little bit of history. So, for example, in 1961, only 12 universities offered anything resembling an accounting degree, and of those, only 3 of those offered the subject, a subject that was actually named accounting. And of course, since then, the growth has been exponential. And just another interesting little statistic, in 1968, there were only 6 full-time accounting professors in the UK, and that jumped up to about 40 plus in 1980, and we are where we are today with well over about 100, maybe and 50. So in the mid-70s, then, accounting has become one of the most popular academic subjects, and the number of accounting degrees has, as I've already said, steadily increased. The expansion has partly been due to the increasing demand from the accounting professional firms, the Big Four or the Big Five or the Big Six, as they used to be called. And accounting UK universities now offer a wide range of degrees from undergraduate to postgraduate, and they've also started specialising more recently in the last maybe 5 or 10 years in specialisms such as forensic accounting, technology-driven accounting such as data analytics, and also offering online and distance learning programs. Now, during this particular period that I'm talking about, particularly since the 1970s, there was substantial influence in shaping the accounting curriculum from the UK professional accountancy bodies. This also is evident right across the world. So the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, and then later on other professional bodies such as the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants and the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, to name a few, they've all played a significant role in shaping accounting education to what it is today. And this is largely through the process of accreditation, which many accounting academics argues constrains what we can do in terms of reforming accounting education. So moving on to the second question, I was asked to talk a little bit about: has accounting contributed to an unequal, inaccessible, colonial and unjust accountancy education system? And in a nutshell, yes, it has, but things are improving. So there was really, I suppose, 3 limited points that I wanted to talk about. First of all, accountancy education. There is unequal access in accountancy education. So for many years, accountancy education has been limited to certain groups, particularly those with economic, social and political privilege. So for example, even today, we find that students from disadvantaged backgrounds still face significant barriers to entry in the form of high tuition fees, limited scholarship opportunities and inadequate educational resources. And some of you will have a full grasp of this, particularly, for example, if you look at the South African context, this is driven home. This unequal access to accountancy education has in turn contributed to a lack of diversity in the accounting profession, which has in turn perpetuated social and economic inequalities. So, for example, although there has been developments in gender equality, that has not happened really at the senior level of the accounting profession. So women, people of colour and other marginalised groups continue to be unrepresented in the profession. And that in turn can limit the extent to which the profession can serve diverse communities effectively. Secondly, there is limited focus, or there has been until relatively recently, on social justice issues. So I think we're all fairly aware, maybe not everyone in the room today is aware, but the accountancy curriculum has been heavily criticised for its focus on technical skills, financial reporting standards, to give 2 examples. with little attention given to broader social justice issues, such as, for example, the common good. And this in turn can perpetuate injustices, not only in the profession, but in society at large. And also Atul mentioned a third issue, which is colonial structures, which also serve to perpetuate existing power structures and social inequalities. So a third question I was asked to talk briefly about was, is accountancy education preparing students for the complex world that awaits them post-university? And in a nutshell, I think it's absolutely not. It is equipping them to deal with that working world in some respects, but is sadly neglecting in others. Before answering that question, we have to have an understanding of who is shaping accountancy education, and a number of stakeholders are relevant here. First of all, the professional accountancy bodies. So the professional accountancy bodies right across the world have established professional qualifications and standards, and in turn, they require that university accounting degrees comply or follow those particular standards to gain accreditation. And in turn, universities throughout the world use this accreditation as a badge to sell their wares, as it were. Secondly, we have the influence of employers who also influence the accounting curriculum to some extent, most notably in terms of the sorts of skills that they expect us to develop for accounting graduates. And thirdly, I think, but most importantly, we have the accounting academics, and we have a significant role in shaping the development of accounting education in the accounting curriculum. So as I said earlier, in addressing the question of whether to abolish or reform accountancy education, I believe that we as accounting educators, we have the greatest potential to make accountancy education more relevant to the needs of society, but we need some tools and some awareness to do that. Now, just to let you be aware, there has been a number of studies. Atul mentioned some of those critical accounting educators, and there have been a number of studies that have been published, and it would be, if you want to read more about this, I would direct you to a study by Prem Sikka et al. In 2007, and he talks about the absolute control, him and his colleagues, talk about the control of the professional accountancy bodies in terms of accreditation, which really hasn't changed significantly. Now, I just wanted to read you a little extract from his paper. The Sikka et al. Argue that the finger is pointed at the poverty of accounting education, because professional accountancy students, these are the people that we train on a daily basis, are encouraged to learn rules and techniques, but with little reflection on their social consequences. The aim of maximizing shareholder wealth takes precedence over any sense of equity, fairness, or justice. Some in the accounting profession, Sikka et al. Argue, frequently appeal to notions of serving the public interest. Yet accounting education schemes provide little or no explanation of this or any evidence showing whether accountancy practices are capable of serving the needs of diverse stakeholders. And I would argue that there's quite a lot of accountancy education is still situated in that arena, as it were. You'll also find some useful critiques of accounting, the state of accounting education. Lee Parker has worked extensively in this in his career, and he published a paper again in 2007 as a follow-up or a commentary to Prem Sikka's work. And he talks about the Australian context, that even when accounting academics were given latitude to do something different in terms of accreditation, they chose to preserve the number crunching focus. They were defending their market share of the business.
Thank
and
you.
that is part of the problem.
Thanks.
So just to finish off then, I've also been asked to discuss, have accountants been agents of positive change? There's actually very little examples of this in the literature. Muhammad Yunus, banker to the poor, is one such example, and he went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. The likes of Professor Richard Murphy and Ian Thomson, Jan Bebbington, Carol Adams are also examples of those who are trying to create a positive developments in this area. So finally, what is the relevance of accounting degrees today and for the future? So I believe that accounting education degrees are relevant, although I don't think that we are developing our accounting graduates in the way that we should for that diverse world. So we clearly have a role in developing accounting graduates who understand the role of accounting and decision makers. Whether we like it or not, financial reports and statements that are produced by accountants are widely used by a range of stakeholders, and we have to have some influence in the content of those. I think we also have we can have an enormous impact in terms of those emerging areas of accounting that Atul has talked about. So, for example, sustainability reporting, social environmental accounting, and forensic accounting, and also business ethics. And I'll be interested to hear what Ian has to say about that. I also think that we have also got a role to play in developing accounting graduates who have analytical and problem solving skills, because those are skills that are required of the workforce. However, I think going back to what I said earlier, this is a complex issue and has been shaped by history. There is an increasing emphasis within the higher education sector on marketization and competition. There has been a prioritization of vocational training and the marginalization of critical thinking and social justice in accounting education. Despite Atul, what you said, I think there's a reduction in the number of critical accounting people in this space. However, I think that we can, there is a need for a fundamental shift in the way accounting is taught and the values and priorities that underpin accounting education. And one such way of addressing that is through a dialogical teaching approach, where the teacher and the students engage in a collaborative process of mutual learning and discovery. And there is a greater emphasis on critical reflection and the exploration of diverse perspectives.
Thank you.
So I think that's me finished. Sorry if I've gone over time.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was fascinating. Our next speaker is Professor Ian Thomson, who is Professor of Business and Sustainability and Director of the Center for Responsible Business at the University of Birmingham. And Ian actually has done a lot to transform the accounting education curriculum at Birmingham. So he will speak from direct experience. Ian, over to you.
Okay, thanks, and thank you, Joan. I'm going to try and do slides. I don't know if that's working. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build, I think, on a lot of the. Fortunately, Joan has kind of set this up really quite nicely. And what I would like to do is to step back a little bit, not necessarily kind of deal directly with some of the criticisms of the accounting programs, which I totally agree are in many cases not fit for purpose. I will say that they do vary enormously from institution to institution, but as a whole, we do have a problem. And what I'm going to do is maybe outline some suggested changes that I think can possibly be useful. And what I'm kind of like arguing for is a shift from accounting degrees to accountability-based degrees, which actually reinforces the purpose and the point of accounting, rather than sort of like focusing sort of very much on how we do numbers, but actually to say, what is it that what's the point of these numbers? But I will actually just kind of pose, just kind of before I move into sort of the suggestion, I think it's important just to imagine a world without accounting. And just try and think about, how would we do things without accounting? Would it necessarily be a better world? Would we, how did kind of like decisions be made before accounting? Was there ever a world without accounting? Accounting historians would argue that it's not. Do we want to go back to the kind of like, I don't know, the sort of like the oppression of the monarchic type rules where people just decide what's actually going to happen, the pre-Enlightenment view of evidence-based kind of like decision making, where we just believed in something and then we went through with it. Would it be a better world? Things like, a lot of the issues that, again, a lot of the really wonderful kind of campaign and work of like that Richard's been involved in, hopefully he'll share with us, about kind of like taxation. If we didn't have accounting, how could we work taxation? How could we criticize the oil companies right now, the energy companies who are making excessive profits, effectively exploiting kind of like certain kind of like conditions that are actually there, at the same time as causing almost potentially irreparable harm to the planet within which we all exist? Would we be able to kind of like to point out these problems without accounting? And would the world be better without accounting, or would the world be better with better accounting? And the argument I'm want to make is the world would be better with better accounting. But we have to sort of like look at, where does accounting come from? What are the kind of the pressures? What are the if you like, the things which are kind of affecting how we behave and the relationships that we actually have? The world is changing, right? We, you know, hopefully that's uncontroversial, but we can maybe have a debate on that. The roles of business are changing. The social and political expectations of acceptable business behavior is radically changing. Practices, for example, we take big tobacco, the tobacco companies. We get sort of examples of some of the pharmaceutical companies, the opioid kind of scandal in America, where these businesses were socially and politically acceptable. In fact, they were incentivized to do things. Now it's no longer a kind of like a problem. We've got changes in tax, subsidies, cost of capital, prices. We've got resource scarcity. We have risks, existential risks to communities, to kind of like to ecosystems. And we've got forecasts that these are actually going to get worse. We've got a greater awareness of the interconnectivity and interdependence so that we actually had. COVID is a wonderful example of bringing to the surface our dependency on others. And this idea of the business or the accountant being the kind of a master of the universe. No, what we actually discovered, we were all slaves to a virus. And we were also slaves to the systems that we'd actually created, and found that they were totally, they lacked resilience to any of these different things. We also have social systems that are actually breaking down, ecological systems that are breaking down, and we've also got sort of like social, economic, and ecological systems there. And we've also got a situation where we have greater visibility and scrutiny on the harm that's actually being happened. Things used to be able to be hidden from sight, but now through accountability and technologies, we're able to actually see and experience these harms that are actually going on. And when we look at accounting, people say, what's this got to do with accounting? Well, accounting, the way in which it's practiced, the way in which it was set up, is actually been identified as a driver of unsustainability. And there's a broad consensus, if we want to have a world that is kind of fit for living, for example, as determined by international consensus like the Sustainable Development Goals, that the accounting practices are going to have to radically change. And we have to recognize, and we have to be cognizant of the fact that many accounting practices unintentionally or intentionally incentivize and perpetuate unsustainable practices, practices which we basically are considered unacceptable. The logic of modern slavery and the logic of accountancy are actually aligned right now in a lot of the practices. That cannot be allowed to continue. So we need radical changes there. And I'd sort of like the work that was actually kind of stealing this from Dillard and Vanari, this idea that we move from accounting-based accountability to accountability-based accounting. What is it that we want to hold people accountable for, and actually work out our accounting from there? And again, it's sort of like still this idea of a Green Deal for accountability degrees. What would they mean? What would they be? I think what we'd need to do is we need to, I'm stealing a lot of these ideas from the EU Green Deal, which somebody might want to kind of like claim credit for later on in the presentation as well. But if we're going to kind of like take on this, what we're going to have to do, we're going to have to change our accounting for the drivers of change, for the change that we actually socially, and there's some consensus that we actually want to move for. That we need to start to move from accounting from simply things like profit, which is a weird, strange measure, how we ever kind of ended up there, to actually accounting for the range of positive benefits that any business or organization creates for other systems, including non-human systems, and looking at the redistributive effect of many of the practices of business. We absolutely need to move towards accounting for negative impacts. It's not just about cherry picking, kind of like for greenwashing purposes, certain thing. We need to create a systemic kind of understanding of these systems which we are kind of like organizations work with and account directly for these negative impacts. Moving away from just cost base, we're looking at the harm which is actually caused in things like biodiversity or the climate or air pollution or human health or human hunger or kind of like decency or gender equality. I could go on. We need to look at accounting not just for businesses, but for a range of different entities. It's not a case where maybe kind of like less accountability, but more accountability. Accountability, not just for a corporation, but for different businesses, for communities, for nations, to look at the consequences of different actions, to account for natural ecosystems, to give them the same power and visibility that we give to a corporation. Why do we do that? How did we end up with that privileging of the corporate form over others? We need to provide evidence to hold organizations and individuals to account for how they manage or damage the interconnectivities and the interdependencies that they have within different systems. We need to account for organizational alignment with their ecosystems to prevent them failing. And when I say prevent them failing, one thing we have to recognize, we often have this idea that the business entity is all powerful. But actually history tells us that when a business or an entity is out of alignment with their social or their ecological system, the social and ecological system win in the long term. Most businesses are fragile, they need to be protected. One of the things we can do is look for this alignment with their ecosystems. And if we start bringing in and looking at accountability degrees and we start looking at these things, not only do we have a sort of like a form of kind of accountability degrees that maybe is future-proof, but is actually going to maybe fulfill the underlying public duty, the common good that's often expected and attributed to accounting that very few accounting degrees and very few accountants actually deliver on. And I'll just finish with this quote from an epidemiologist, Hans Rosling, who wrote a wonderful book called Factfulness. And I think it gets to the nub of what we're actually trying to do in accounting and this tension that we have. And this quote is that the world cannot be understood without numbers, but the world cannot be understood with numbers alone. I think too often in accounting degree programs, we've just focused on producing numbers without context, without purpose, without consequence, without narrative, and without understanding why we're doing accounting and the consequences of doing it badly. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Here, Ian. Thank you so much. That was fantastic and a real boost to this new campaign. That a very expert and eminent researcher has actually said that accounting really needs a dramatic paradigm shift, and just as the icebergs are melting, the accounting education system ought to melt to create a world which is sustainable. So well done. Thank you. Next is Professor Richard Murphy. Many of you may know him from Twitter. He's got over 100,000 followers on Twitter. He's at the University of Sheffield. Again, has written hundreds of articles, some very popular books, and is a chartered accountant. So he's a member of the accounting profession, but at the same time critical of it. So over to you, Richard.
Well, thank you. I did prepare some slides, but frankly, they're already irrelevant because Joan and Ian have already hit many themes that I've already wanted to touch on. So I'm going to freelance at this moment. And I'm going to say how much I agree with what has been said here. I come from this from a strange perspective, in a sense. I never intended to end up as a professor of accounting. Unlike other professors here, that wasn't my first career choice. I chose to be a chartered accountant. I did what was half an accounting degree over 40 years ago now. I became a chartered accountant. I became an accounting trainer in a firm. I was senior partner of a firm. And then I became a campaigner. And as a result of that, I've ended up as an accounting professor. So it's been an interesting journey to get to this point. And I don't at the moment teach. At Sheffield, I'm doing almost entirely research, which sometimes I feel is a big shame. The great relief is I don't do any marking, which I have to admit I can leave behind. But what worries me about the whole way in which we look at accounting education is so much of it is irrelevant. And I say this actually as the father of a son who's doing an accounting degree at the moment, who seems to have been convinced that the one thing he does not want to do in life is be an accountant as a result, which may be not the outcome that people wanted from him. So why has he done a degree which he thought was going to be one thing, and which is simply preparation for a further professional training, which isn't what he wanted? And I think that's really important, because that isn't what I see the role of a degree to be in this situation. I know there are degrees that are vocational and that they need to be vocational. I'm married to a doctor, a medical doctor, and that is what a medical degree is. And as she points out, she has had no academic training despite 5 years at university. She went and did a degree in medical ethics afterwards, simply to discover what academia was all about. That's slightly sad, you might say. It also just shows the frustration that she hadn't been taught how to think. And I think that's the paradox that we deal with when we look at accounting education now. And Ian has said it, Joan has said it, we talk about numbers. And I look at accounting exams, which are set in so many places, and I've seen them from all sorts of places. Why are we teaching accounting people so much finance when actually so little of that finance will ever be used by them in their professional careers? What is that about? Shouldn't we be offering finance degrees if people want to do finance, and accounting for degrees if people want to do accounting, or maybe, as Ian says, an accountability degree? Why are we offering them as if they are integral wholes when I really don't think they are? Why are we providing so much vocational training so that you have to learn how to, oh, God knows, account for the revaluation of a building in your balance sheet and recognize the realized and unrealized reserves, and then what is more, do the disposal, as if knowing how to put that through your statutory accounts is the be all and end all of your professional education? I've got to tell you, it isn't. That is not what accounting is about. Accounting is actually understanding relationships in society which exist through the organizations that we construct to deliver our social purpose. And as Ian says, those are by no means entirely for profit enterprises, although some are, and I am quite happy to say I've run a fair few of those in my time, as well as others which aren't. The point is that we need to actually think about even then what that means. I had a lovely comment put on my blog this morning, which is the sort of thing that one day I'd like a student of accounting to be able to discuss. It said, money is an entity that only exists in a quantum reality. It can only be in two places at the same time, as a debit and a credit. Every debt is someone's asset. Now that takes us right back to the core of what accounting is: debits and credits. And yet at the same time, it makes clear that every transaction, every issue we look at is about a relationship. And what we're forgetting in accounting is that we are accounting for that relationship. Every single issue that we want to put into a set of accounts involves us in relationship with somebody else, and almost invariably is measured at the point where a boundary is crossed. Now, I don't think that that conceptual idea is in any way sufficiently developed. There you have a discussion which could become academic. At that point, you can begin to discuss what is the entity? Who is it reporting to? To whom does it have responsibility? Who are its stakeholders, to use the phrase which is out of fashion, but wholly appropriately raised? I mean, I run the Corporate Accountability Network. We reckon there are 6 stakeholders, and we only deal with half of one of them, basically. We report a set of accounts to the shareholders. They aren't even all the providers of capital, let alone the trading relationships, the employees, the regulators, the tax authorities, and civil society in all its vast forms, of which I've also had the pleasure of being a part for some time as a campaigner. None of that stuff is provided to us. And we have a body, the IFRS, which is arrogant enough to say that everybody, but those who they decide are relevant, who are the suppliers of capital, everybody else can make do with whatever they can get. And we aren't saying, is that okay? You can get through a 3-year undergraduate accounting course and not actually be asked to write the essay, justify that element of the conceptual framework. Paragraph 1.2 of the conceptual framework of the IFRS, I suspect, in very many places, because that question isn't asked. Fundamentally, the neoliberal framing of accounting is adopted. And I think that is because, and bluntly, and I'll say it, the body of which I'm a member and the other professional bodies, because I know I'm not the only professional accountant here by any means, but the ICAEW in my case is saying this is what accounting is. And I think, and I know the ICAEW think this, that is not what accounting is about. I have discovered that there's a problem with my chair, as you've just realized. It sinks. And I was going below the screen. I was wondering where I was going. I need a new chair. The vacuum's going, or whatever the air pump is. So I've just arrived again, back in the seminar. We need to ask, why is it that we have, and Ian has mentioned this, why is it? And I've done that. That's why we did the work we did in the Tax Justice Network. That's why in all the areas I've been working about. Who are you accountable to? And one of the fascinating things that I found throughout that is in my interaction with so many professional firms, and I've dealt with all the big four many, many times over in many, many jurisdictions around the world now, it's always the case that actually their biggest goal in life is to make sure that nobody knows. You set up secrecy jurisdictions to make sure that nobody knows what's going on. That is the whole purpose of using a tax haven. Nobody knows what's going on. It might be to tax abuse, it might just be to abuse your spouse, your creditors, or anyone else. But the point is, don't tell the world what's going on. This is the profession that we are actually training people to belong to, and where we have to change that culture to be one of the person has a right to know. In the UK, 93% roughly of all accounts filed at Companies House do not include an income statement, and the balance sheet is so meaningless as it's of no use to anyone. We cripple the ability of small businesses to appraise the credit risk they take. We're trading with other limited liability entities by refusing to put on record the accounts that are required to make the small business communities of the UK work. How is that a pro-business agenda? And yet we're not challenging that. You can come at this from a right-wing perspective and say accounting is failing just as readily as you can from the agenda which I do, which I admit is left of centre, where I'm saying I want green accounting. And when we come to green issues, I loved the paper I read earlier this week from EY. They published it actually late last year. And for those who are familiar with the concept of a provisioning event in IAS 37, sorry, I'm going back into the jargon of technical accounting. But there it was, EY saying, be very careful as to the commitments that you make in the narrative reporting of your accounts, because you might create a provisioning event that could mean you have to put onto the balance sheet the potential cost of delivering net zero, which is exactly the work I'm doing on sustainable cost accounting. You could not esteem it laid out more starkly what Ian was just saying there, the accounting profession trying to deny its responsibility for accountability for sustainability. So we have to move away from this idea of numbers. We have to move away from the idea that finance and ethics and accounting are one and the same thing. We have to offer degrees which are in accounting and degrees in finance for those who want them. And we have to move towards a situation where we talk about what is accountability, who are we accountable for, to, what are the ethics surrounding these relationships, that we have to understand that double entry is not just within the organization. I hear you, Atul, I'll finish in just a second. The double entry is not just in the organization, but actually the other side of the entry is outside the organization, and we have to think about the responsibility to them, and we have to deliver an accounting system that actually meets the needs of users of and society, because we're going to go through the biggest change. The younger people we're teaching are going to go through this change, and we're not preparing them for it. And in my opinion, that's a failure on our part. We need accounting degrees, but not the ones we've got.
Thank you so much, Richard. Richard is, actively communicating with the world through his Twitter and blogs. So he actually has a pulse on how people think and how they respond to different ideas. And it's very interesting how you speak from your experience as a professional accountant. Our last but not least speaker is Sneha Shah. Now, we've touched a little bit about diversity. Sneha's comes culturally from India, was raised in East Africa, and currently is at the University of Warwick studying accounting in her final year. She also spent a year at a Big Four firm doing a placement. So she brings practical experience to the table. And Sneha, over to you. She's speaking in a world which has been male-dominated, in an accounting world male-dominated, and yet she comes from such a diverse heritage. So Sneha, let's hear your perspective, which I'm sure many young people will relate to in this audience.
Definitely. So my name is Sneha. I definitely do have a very diverse background, and it's nice to hear from our professors what they think and how I think as a student. So yeah, I'll be talking about this topic from a student perspective. I will be very, very honest. I was not aware of how much we need to rethink accounting, but this topic has given me a major insight within my own diverse experiences about how accounting studies need to be made better for the future. So let's start by talking about how businesses work in my country, in Kenya. So we have smaller scale vegetable sellers who usually keep a mobile phone and a notebook to record their sales and classify how much of it is revenue. And this is like basic cash basis accounting, right? And through this presentation, I went all the way back in my first year to see how accounting was defined in my very first lecture. And it was defined as the art of recording, classifying, and communicating information and so on. However, with everything that I've experienced, I just don't think it's more than just an old, boring corporate definition. I've seen accounting more as like a technical, social, and a moral practice. And I think this should be reflected in the content now of what we expect as a future accountant. So, we should be having more diverse content, especially integrating the different cultures, perspectives, and, how accounting is used by different professions and even in everyday life, such as how accounting is useful to this vegetable seller. Traditional finance education is all about standards, public interest, and how it works within general accounting practice. And I think it's time we reform accounting education. So another thing that was mentioned earlier, I completed my year in industry within a Big Four firm, which I did absolutely truly enjoy. My job was to check a few numbers here and there to see that there are no material misstatements. However, it got me thinking, things like customer relationships, employee relationships, how how can we measure that in terms of ethics? Yes, we're learning about integrated reporting currently in university, and yes, that exists. And we do have all that kind of information that's being shown in these reports. But as auditors, let's be honest, how much of that are we checking to confirm that they're correct, as opposed to all the other accounts that we have to check in the financial statement? Now, that was a perspective of me being in the field. Why am I telling you this? So again, another part of my diverse kind of background is that I come from a family where there's a family business. So I read this on Google and was very shocked, but around 81% of businesses established globally are family businesses. And that's a huge number. And yet this is not highly spoken about in education, which I was very, very shocked to hear. And, it's nice that because in smaller firms, the owners are also managers who directly are part of the decisions and the processes of the business. They directly feel the success or the fail at a personal level. Whereas, when a big company fails, it impacts a larger audience. And this contrasting set of view is missing within our education, this diverse contrasting set of view. And I just want to talk a bit about myself now, just a bit about my family business back at home. The way the family business is conducted. You have a close relationship with your suppliers. My father speaks to customers directly via the phone, and employees are just, sorry, am I sharing my screen? Yeah, sorry. And employees are just kind of, they work directly with the owner. They're kind of like a small family. They know everything that's going on in the business, just as this photo right here. This is something that's common growing up in Kenya. We invited our employees to a family wedding that we had recently in Kenya, and I think that's quite uncommon right here. So I feel like adding more diversity in accounting education of the way accounting really works between different businesses, different types of cultures, brings a personal element to a lot of students as well. I don't remember when I sat with a group of students from different parts of the world and spoken about how accounting works in their country. Hence, I thought this was quite interesting to share. Now let's get to the real deal. Rethinking accounting in university education. Now here you can see some headlines around ethical failures. And within a lot of my modules, especially this year, we're always hearing about cases that have suffered ethical tension. And these are most probably around big firms. And I've hardly ever heard about smaller firm scandals as an example for people who are more intrigued to know about that and ethical tensions going around those and how it impacts a wider firm or wider population. In fact, at the moment, I think when I was reviewing everything, that our education at the moment is not challenging enough to promote ethics and integrity in finance. In my second year, I took a management module, and in the management module, one of our coursework was required to assess how some of these firms can incorporate the sustainable development goals with innovative ideas, proposals, and projects, which kind of resonated strongly with the COVID-19 climate. But why is this not being taught in accounting, as a way to strengthen the sustainability of ethics in businesses and ways we can reinforce its implementation? Yes, we have the famous 5 fundamental principles of professional ethics, which I'm sure most people here are aware of. And I don't think that's enough to establish the ethical behaviors and mentality. I think it would be reasonable to emphasize on the importance of ethics education to improve more reasoning from the root level, which is from first year itself. And, for someone who's rooting to become a future professional accountant, if this was taught in first year, I would know what to expect going into the industry. I would know how important ethical education is. And it's not that these modules are not being offered within the curriculum. It's more that they're optional modules. I have more pressing modules like business taxation to take for my exemption. So I do believe that it should be made compulsory. And lastly, another thing, I follow the values of Jainism, so that's my culture, and ethical considerations are very important to me. So as a first year, when I was in my first year, if we included ethical education, this would play a huge and a very beneficial part on my day-to-day living, and it would connect to a diverse range of belief systems as well. You know, it would have made me feel more inclusive within the curriculum as well, which would kind of bring a better motivation to learn. Yeah, so I just want to end my presentation by saying that, you know, with my diverse range of background, like I'm born in Kenya, I'm of Indian origin, but I'm living in the UK. I have a contrasting set of experiences. I see this being currently irrelevant to all the rules and theories being taught in university, because there is no personal element. And yeah, just, you know, I read this somewhere, and I want to end my presentation stating that, you know, the world is changing, our profession is changing, technical ability is important, but so is character. Hence, it's also essential that we reform accounting studies for a more sustainable future to kind of reflect what it is now. Thank you.
Here, Sneha. Thank you so much. You're very brave, and you can see the claps from the professors as well. So yeah, it's actually a very diverse and very unique world out there. Students have their own stories and experiences of accounting and finance, but these are rarely discussed in the classroom. They need to be brought into the classroom so that, you know, students can take accounting personally. At the moment, we just literally have a curriculum which is very, very corporate, and then suddenly we throw a little bit of ethics as a sprinkler to that, and without actually making the whole subject, discipline, the study personal, social, and environmental at the same time, as Ian pointed out. Okay, so over to you. Time for some questions, and Professor Susan Smith from the UCL Institute of Education, sorry, UCL University, will be also helping us with your questions, and then she will do a summary at the end. So over to you. Tell us what your questions are for the panel, and if possible, you could name the panelist that you want to ask. Please try and post your questions on the chat so we can see them. And you could even share just your experiences, so it doesn't have to be a question, even a comment is fine.
So I think the first question I can see is Stuart Smith has a question. Stuart, would you like to go ahead? Oh, maybe he's not there anymore.
Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, I am here. Sorry, I was not quite used to the format. I wasn't sure that I could actually get on and open my mic. Yeah, look, it's just as the question kind of set out, because a lot of our programs are dominated by accreditations with the professional bodies. So what's the strategy? How do we deal with this? On the one hand, we could say, let's just ditch those accreditations straight off and start to do something different, right? Or if we're going to keep the relationship with the professional bodies, what are the prospects of us leveraging those relationships and getting the professional bodies to change their syllabuses to match what we need to do, rather than we seem to jump to their kind of demands? So what can we do to turn the power relationship around in that case?
Yeah, brilliant question, very relevant. So anybody from the panel want to take that?
I think Ian's looking like he's ready to answer this one.
Yeah, hi Stuart. I've got a few answers to one. First thing, I get really annoyed when people say we can't do like social, environmental, and anything because it's not in the accreditation program. My first answer to anyone who comes at us, say, show me where it says you can't do that, and I will show you where it is in the syllabus. There has been some really good, particularly I think ACCA have done some wonderful work. David Campbell, who's sadly kind of passed, did a wonderful piece of actually putting critical, social, environmental stuff into professional accountancy exams. There is absolutely no barrier to introducing any of the things that have been introduced that contradict any accreditation requirement. There are some people who will say that they do it, but actually it often doesn't exist. The other thing is that we also need to engage, I think, as an academic community, engage a bit more forcefully. And I know it's a slightly reluctant with Joan, but I mean you got a really good way of kind of like getting over sort of like assertive kind of engagement, a lot more than I've actually been able to do. But we need to engage with them. If we sit back and go, oh no, it's the professional accountancy bodies, they don't want it. When you actually talk to them, they do. They actually do. It's actually embedded. There's nothing that we talked about today that isn't already on a professional accounting syllabus. They hide it. They maybe don't do it more, but that shouldn't be a barrier. Personally, if it was me, I would ditch accreditation because I think it ties us to a profession. I believe that we should be educating through the medium of accountability, not training people to become accountants. And I think the accreditation gets in the way. Now, you have to also remember that not every institution in the UK actually submitted to accreditation. A lot of them said, we'd rather not be accredited. Guess what happened? They were the ones who were producing the students that the people actually wanted. Mm-hmm. So the kind of like, it's a self-imposed, it's a Foucauldian type of self-discipline here that isn't actually kind of merited in the real world. And I know that certainly when we were at Strathclyde, we had a very critical curriculum. And actually we had the most desirable candidates for professional accountancy bodies. So I'm sure other people will come in, but there's two things there. One is it's a myth that accreditation stops you doing things. And I also think that we should be, some courageous universities should take the step and say, we're not going to do it. And let's kind of like move on in that thing.
Can I just follow up just quickly? Sorry, Atul. I agree with what you're saying, but I actually think the system is too big to dismantle it. I think that accreditation is here and it's not going to go away anytime soon. However, some of the things you said, you're absolutely right, Ian. Sometimes we impose this on ourselves, but I think that's because of a number of reasons. I think that we need to see more people engaging in this sort of education that we're talking about. And there's almost like safety in numbers. So if you're in an institution where there's hardly anybody doing anything outside of the norm, it's very difficult actually to stick your neck out because you're going to get criticized by your colleagues, you're going to get criticized by the students, etc. I think as well, Ian, though, we could do better as a community of educators. We could share more how we do this here. I think there should be more, for example, maybe we should be developing more textbooks which show us how to do this sort of thing so that other people will get more confidence in doing this. So I think it's a big problem, but I think we could be better we could also be better at engaging with our professional bodies, because if you work in different universities over your lifetime, you see the absolute differences in the way that accreditation requirements are applied, and they all count for accreditation. So maybe we should be doing more as a community.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to briefly take up Ian's point about dialogue with the professions. The professions are saying, like the ICAEW is saying, its primary objective is to enable sustainable development in business, right? So if it's saying that, we can actually say, okay, then can you come and say that from tomorrow, we are not going to accredit any degrees which do not encourage students to develop their own professional ethics, judgment skills, critical skills, and ability to ask difficult questions and challenge. So if the professional bodies were to say that we will stop accreditation at university level unless it is critical, it is it allows students to bring their own diversity and cultural and ethical perspective, etc., we will not accredit. So then again, the dialogue changes. So that's just my suggestion. Richard, you wanted to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, if I can, and there's another question which I've now lost on the thread, which was actually asked, and I said I'd try and answer it. Anwar asked a question on the same sort of thing. I mean, my point here is actually to tell people, the students, that you can become an accountant without that accreditation. Because vast numbers of people become qualified accountants who have not got an accounting degree. You don't need to be accredited to become a chartered accountant, whichever version of chartered accountancy it might be. And instead, what you need to do is actually think about what will make me a better accountant. If the person is that motivated by money, and I know some young people are, that is their fundamental motive. What is it that will make you a better accountant, differentiate you from the crowd? What does my accounting degree mean that I can do that somebody who's been through the mill of the training firms that the professional organizations will use, some of which will even claim to be universities now, what is it that this degree adds to my prospects of my career? And surely that is the stuff that won't be done by the professional firms when they provide the training. Therefore, the accreditation can in fact be a negative. You're wasting time, which you could cover by a few months of extra training during the course of your training program with that firm. I just feel that we should be upfront and honest and say you'll get a better training, a better degree, a better choice if you don't go down the accreditation route. And you will one day be a better accountant, because the accreditation route will get you as far as being an accountant. But if you want to be a finance director, and if you want to be a critical perspectives person, you want to understand what's missing, then you need to do something much more. And that's what this degree can provide. You can only become an accountant by becoming accredited. We can take you much further. That's the confidence that as academics, I think we need to have. Tell people we can add to your ability to think, whereas accreditation will do nothing to deliver that. That's my belief anyway, but I'm a bit black and white about this.
Susan, you want to pick up?
Yep, sure. We've got a question from, I'll go to the next one on the chat. I'll go on. Sepide is the next one. Do you want to ask your question live? So maybe I'll go if
I think there are a couple of questions from the American perspective.
Yeah, okay, let's do those.
So yeah, let's do those. So they're basically saying that in America, it's a very much a straitjacket in terms of accounting, and critical accounting is virtually off the syllabus. So how can we help and guide them in this area? Anybody?
I've been to the States and I've spoken at conferences there on accounting education. And I came away deeply disheartened and felt that the rigidity of the syllabus and the absolute control of the need to provide this basic number crunching approach was so dire that it made our system look great by comparison. And I felt really sorry for the accounting academics who are doing the basic teaching in this, because they are literally doing a non-academic course in its entirety. There's no questioning. And you know, I don't have a problem with a teaching academic route in life. I mean, there are such things, and some people want to do that, and that's fine. But this seemed to have no crossover between teaching, research, and critical thinking at all. And I was deeply depressed by it and thought, well, I won't go back to talk to them again. And I haven't, but that's because I have now given up flying the Atlantic.
So I guess in a way, the answer would be to somehow work with the AICPA, which has now taken over CIMA as well. So they are also trying to be a global organization, and and maybe work from this with the global organization to say, look, it's in your best interest to change the method of accounting training in America.
Yeah, I mean, talking to CIMA, because it's the institute that I belong to, and they're actually actively thinking about these things, and I think it's often a way about trying to find a route into these things. Climate change is a really good way in to disrupt these programs, because it's real. I mean, it's hidden balance sheet. It's value, how you value assets. If you like, you could take, like at Birmingham, we've mainstreamed climate kind of accounting and finance across all of our modules. And it was actually relatively straightforward to link it to assurance, to asset valuation, to finance, to costing, to budgeting, to performance measurements, all these different things. And so I think there's often a need to try and find a way in. If some of the, obviously some American colleagues are kind of like are talking there, the way in which I find was really effective was to take a real business problem as a starting point, not to go in theoretically and say, I'm talking about social construction, kind of like deconstructing neoliberal ideology and basically going, how can we value an asset? How can we measure pollution? How can we measure positive contribution? And if you start to take that type of issue, take a problem that people are experiencing, and then start reflecting about accounting, you can bring these in. And I think there's some really interesting work. I kind of mentioned in the chat, looking at places like Harvard and MIT and all these other schools. They're majoring, they've got climate stuff kind of coming right into their program. They're doing some really interesting stuff in that space. It is, in many ways, this is mainstream, not critical. And I think, and I mean, I do really like kind of Richard's just the flipping accounting logic, conventional accounting logic on its head and saying, you've got to do something. You've admitted you've got to do something. Go do the accounts. And that's where accounting's powerful. And if we can take mainstream stuff and say, how can we value sort of like an oil reserve? That's not critical. But actually, see, if you try and do it, it becomes critical by doing the normal accounting practices. And that's what we've actually got to do. Not make this start off with it. We go in with the problems, the challenges, the reality that people are facing, and then sort of like work it through that way. And it's amazing how powerful accounting can be as a problematizing technology, because underpinning it, we value it. And we've also got things like prudence. You know, we've got everything's on our side in this one, where we can actually kind of like blast in.
Yeah, one way I do that is by taking students on field trips, literally within the local area or to the Institute of or the City of London, and really get them and ask questions as I travel, but also explain to them the history and how these things came to be what they are. And these trips are really memorable. So again, we need to take accounting out of the classroom and into the real world and give students experiences. Sepida is ready, I think.
Yes, I am. Sorry about earlier.
Welcome,
I didn't know
Sepida.
how to unmute myself. So thank you very much. I look at this from a slightly different angle. I look at it more from a labor rights point of view, especially that, a couple of years ago, we had Modern Slavery Act in the UK. And, many promises were made by the government to change the act or to strengthen the act. So, so far nothing has happened, and there doesn't seem to be an appetite for any changes to be made. At the same time, we can see that there are changes happening in mainland Europe in terms of Due Diligence Processes Act, for example, in Germany, and also what is happening in European market in terms of making sustainability reporting mandatory. I just wonder, what role do you think, how we can make changes when there isn't an appetite on part of governments? And it's not only government in this country. I'm talking about large countries such as, for example, in China, If you look at the reports of large Chinese companies, they hardly report on their sustainability activities. And yet we see many large Chinese companies listed on Forbes, I don't know, large 50 Forbes companies. So how do we deal with this? I find this very puzzling, because internationally, how can we actually address this? And how successfully do you think that it is going to be more than one question? So I ask the next question later. So thank you.
Anybody want to take that? No? Okay. Yeah.
Richard looks like he's got his hand up.
Yeah, can I just jump in very briefly? I don't know why we don't have an accounting standard for employment and employees. It just seems to me to be totally baffling that this most vital of stakeholder groups has no accounting standard, and that the disclosures required in the UK, which are better than many places around the world with regard to employment and employee costs and relationships and all the associated issues that go with that, have got worse over my professional career. We've gone so far backwards with regard to disclosure in this area rather than forwards. Why is that? I just don't know. If there was one area, I mean, I like writing accounting standards. I make a hobby of writing accounting standards. I wrote one to celebrate my son sleeping through the night, probably the only person who'll ever do that in history, but it is now the law in 90 countries around the world. Now, the point is, we need to be brave enough to write our own standards and actually take on the profession at that level too and say, you're not up to it. We can do this. And this is an area where if we set the task, we could come up with the standard to answer your questions. And I think students could be interactive in that process because they understand as much as anyone what the issues are that they want to know from an employer. Because an accounting standard for employers would be for past, present, and future employees. All of those would be really important. And that's an area which I'm very keen to work on. It's on my agenda, but not at the top of my agenda, unfortunately.
You've just given me a brilliant idea for projects for students. Is like, you don't get them to kind of like apply standards, get them to write standards on problems that they face. It's kind of genius. You just imagine a class, you just suddenly go, no, it's not about kind of, has this can't been applied here? Let's look at a problem like slavery. Let's look at a problem of kind of gender inequality. Let's look at, kind of like all these different things. Write a standard to do that. Genius. But I've read it.
Thank you. I'd like to do the guest lecture as well with you, Ian, on that one.
Thank you. So I think time is rolling on. So thanks for the questions. I think the panel has been trying to answer your questions on the chat. We'll now ask Susan to do a summary of the session today, and then Mzwanele will do the final few words. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to everybody who participated in today's webinar. Hopefully this is the start of many more to come and some real momentum behind the campaign to reform accountancy or rethink accountancy education. Today we heard from Professor Joan Ballantine, who set the scene around filling in the knowledge about why the degrees are the way they are and how they evolved to become this way. She is in favor of reforming the degree and highlighted some of the constraints due to the relationships between the profession, the firms, and universities. And that's really a triad that has, as I think Ian said, has created its own constraints in some ways. Nobody wants to break ranks because of the implications on student recruitment, yet everybody can see that it's forcing a very homogeneous syllabus in many cases. We then heard from Ian Thomson, who again is in favour of reforming the accounting degrees and called for a Green Deal for accounting degrees. And I think that that's an important point there. He reminded us that accounting changes behaviour, and that can be both intentional and unintentional. And we should be examining those consequences of accounting and accountability with our students to make them more critical and aware of those unintended consequences. We then heard from Richard Murphy, who asked us to challenge the accepted norms and asked us, why are we privileging providers of capital above all others as stakeholders? Why are we not thinking of other stakeholders? How can we change the culture around accounting and accountability? And how do we break free of some of the interests that are channeling our behaviours and the behaviours of the profession? And then finally, we heard from Sneha, who's a student at the University of Warwick and who has been very brave joining such a distinguished panel today. And we thank her for sharing her perspective with us. She also raised concerns around the narrow scope of accounting within accounting degrees and the way that it's portrayed as certain and technical and objective rather than subjective and social and negotiated in many ways. She reminded us that the majority of businesses globally are actually family businesses, and those are largely neglected in accounting education. She also reminded us of the cultural practices and aspects that are so important in understanding the contextual nature of practice in any context, and the ethics that underpin everything that goes on. So questions that came from the audience reminded us that there are constraints internationally, and we heard that in the States that's particularly the case. We also heard that we should try to work with the profession and not against the profession. We should try and build a coalition to move things forward and to do what we can in the meantime. That there's nothing saying you cannot. We need to work out how we can within the constraints we wish to place upon ourselves as educators. So I hope I have provided a reasonable summary of events today, and I'd like to thank the speakers again and hand back to Mzwa.
Mzwanele.
Thank you so much, Prof. Susan, and thank you so much, Program Director, Prof. Atul. I am quite overwhelmed, thrilled, and excited by the vigorous conversations that have taken place here. I am really sitting in a way to say that indeed you cannot stop an idea whose time has come. And here we really are going to see the change that we are speaking of. And we have globally, indeed, not only in the UK, the agency required to bring about that change. So I really would like to firstly thank the Geoffrey Trust for financing and being able to support this campaign. And I'd like to thank Rethinking Accounting and Rethinking Accountancy for organizing the event, and all the technical team that has been behind this, Perry, Lawrence, as well as Tom. Thank you very much for assisting us to run this session very smoothly. And I would like to really thank our panelists that have been here today and gave us really a lot to think about from different views, as Susan has nicely and well summarized. That historical perspective from Prof. Joan was really awakening, and it really assisted to sort of inform us as to why we are here today, and how we can foster a way forward in creating the sustainable futures that we speak about. And thanks to Prof. Thomson, who has basically decided to create some of these alternatives that we can think about in creating a more just and sustainable future, and to really think to say, why do we not offer an accountability degree? Because that would be a different conversation, and indeed would invite everyone else to say, oh, well, we've not been doing everything right, and indeed we need to create and foster the alternatives. And thank you very much to Richard Murphy for agitating the system and really inviting us to relook and rethink the practices and even the motivations for teaching accounting and the practicing the accountancy. That really is awakening. And Sneha, I think closing off there and giving such a cultural perspective and the diversity and the importance of centering the work that we do in our culture, in our ethics, in our background is very much important, because I think, like we're saying throughout the session, that there's been this pressure, or rather this edge, to sort of separate accounting from the practices and from who we are as individuals, our faiths, our beliefs, our religions, and our cultures. So thank you very much for sort of inviting us to reflect on that and see how we apply those concepts into the work that we do. I would really like to thank all the participants. The questions have been also one of the most exciting parts of this webinar for me. The engagements from the participants has been also igniting. So thank you very much. I hope that you will continue to support the work of Rethinking Accountancy, as well as Rethinking Economics, and all the work to rethink the education curriculum that we teach. I hope, and I'm inviting you all to follow us on our social media pages and our platforms on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, to continue the engagements, so that we can indeed see each other more often and create the alternatives and preach the alternatives. And I thank you very much, you all, for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mzwanele, and we wish you all the best in championing this campaign. And I loved your starting. It's an idea whose time is come. So now all we can do is go forward and enable, especially the young idealists, to really bring about a generational change in accounting education. Thank you, and good night and good day to everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.